Now, it took a while, but just this year, the U.S. government recently issued a food waste reduction goal, calling for a 50% cut by 2030. By contrast, Europe is already ahead of the curve. In July, France became the first country in the entire world to ban supermarkets from discarding unsold food. And Italy's agricultural ministry will invest €1 million into researching fresh ways to package foods to prevent spoilage and to extend shelf life. My colleague Rachelle Akuffo spoke to Ben Simon. He's the CEO he's the CEO about his company, Imperfect Produce. She has more insight.
One thing that France and Italy and some countries in Europe are doing and looking at is actually mandating top-down as a government that all grocery stores within their country recover their food at the end of the day. So if you look at America, most of our grocery stores still throw out their extra food at the end of the day. I know from experience, I've actually done some consulting with some of the largest grocery stores in the country, some of the largest hotel chains in the country, and most of these big chains don't have any program in place, at least not on a national level. They might have a few stores here and there in different regions observing different donation standards and practices, but as a whole, most of the grocery store chains in America are still throwing out a lot of food. Most of their actual good food at the end of the day, which altogether amounts to hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds of food collectively, all the grocery stores in America. So that's a big opportunity there, and that's something that, as you mentioned, Italy and France, they're doing that. They've just gone out ahead and said, you know what, we're going to mandate this, that all grocery stores have to donate that food.
Let's talk about the root of the global supply chain when it comes to food waste, from farm to table. What's happening along that route in terms of food waste?
When we talk about food waste, one really important thing to realize is that food waste is not a single problem, but it's actually a collection of hundreds of different problems along the food supply chain, all the way from farm to consumers. And actually the two largest places where the most food is going to waste are kind of bookending that supply chain. So the most waste is happening on farms and is also happening at the consumer level, what we then eat. But if you start with farms, we have, at least in this country, in America, we have about 1 in 5 fruits and vegetables, it's estimated by the Natural Resources Defense Council, are going to waste, largely because they're too ugly for the grocery store. And that's what my business, Imperfect Produce, that's where we're taking action, is recovering that food. Then as you move further along the supply chain, you have different inefficiencies, you have surpluses in the market, you have shrink that you see at every stage of the supply chain. Once it gets to a food distributor, they might have overages of product, or they might have what's called a kicked load at the grocery store level, where basically product will arrive and the grocery store will look at the product and pick up the phone and tell the grower, no, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take this. In some cases, it's because there actually is an issue with the product, but in a lot of the cases, it is sort of a form of bullying where they've just ordered too much, so they just go ahead and kick the load. Sometimes it gets, rerouted to a food bank, but in many cases, that product does go to waste.
How much money are we talking about here when it comes to how much is being lost just because of food waste?
Well, it's a lot of money. In America, it's estimated that it's about $165 billion per year is the price tag on how much food we're wasting in this country. Globally, I don't have a number in terms of a dollar amount for you, but I know that while America wastes 40% of their food as a country, globally we're wasting about a third of our food. So, it's a pretty high price tag. I think it's got to be somewhere in the ballpark of $1 trillion.
We have this cycle where consumers throw out food, feel bad, but then we seem to do it again every single week. How do we break this cycle? What are some better strategies so we can really open our eyes and really make some concrete efforts to curb food waste?
What I've seen a lot of people do, and what I've done recently, is to create a Eat This First shelf, where you put a little tag and say, eat this first. And you're sort of constantly reorganizing your fridge as you go throughout the week so that you actually have a shelf where, you've got those vegetables that may only have a few days of shelf life on them. And you got to have some discipline here. You got to eat that first before you go and order takeout.
What about environmental? What's some of the fallout that you're seeing from people really not addressing this properly?
It's estimated actually that if food waste was its own country, the greenhouse gas emissions from it would actually be third in the world, second only to the US and China. So it's a lot. The greenhouse gas emissions, the contribution to climate change, because we also have to think about the fact that not only all the resources I just mentioned going into growing the food, but then once you waste the food, once it's in a landfill, it gives off methane gas, which is 21 times more harmful towards climate change than CO2. But a huge part of the discussion that's really missing right now is how do we recover more of that food that's currently been wasted? 40% of our food in this country, it's so much food. And one last stat to leave you off on by the Natural Resources Defense Council is that if we're actually to recover, just a small amount of the food that we're wasting, just 15% of it, that would actually be enough to feed 25 million Americans. So half of America's hungry population, their full diets throughout the year, just by recovering 15% of the food that's currently wasted. So from fighting climate change to fighting hunger, we got to start fighting food waste. There's a lot of room for improvement here.